exactly.
Okay, so then you have two places
Yeah.
where it's been recorded.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
Okay, so I'll start. Okay, welcome everyone. Yeah, good to see everyone. Like maybe some of these faces are unfamiliar to you. Maybe like I suppose if you are watching this and there will not be a lot of you, you might know some of these faces. So I can say that like the person probably resembling me most, I think that's fair to say, is my father. He is the somewhat older fella here, and we've had conversations in the past. Some of you might know Paul van der Klei's work. We had a couple of conversations with Paul van der Klei. And I'm also gonna already be doing a brief promotion because there's gonna be the Breakwater Festival, the 5th until the 7th of July, actually in Leusden in the Netherlands, which is where you are based right now. And you're going to be speaking at that. So that's just very briefly on you, and I'll allow you to introduce yourself a little bit more in your background. And besides that, we have the now very famous in this little corner, Graham Dempsey, who's been, I think, very generous to all of us to, yeah, I don't know, really get involved in very, I don't know, productive and generative conversations on the question of what is metamodern Christianity, and is it something desirable? Are there risks involved? And to really be open-minded in that regard and be willing to listen to others, but at the same time also really be clear in what he thinks is important about that. And so I think what I'll do, like I'll give you like both, if that's okay, like a little bit of an elevator pitch on maybe what you might find interesting in this angle, but maybe not like too much, because I would also find it interesting to see to what extent maybe Bas, you can steelman Brandon's position, and then we can kind of see, by the way, this is not going to be a debate, it's just going to be
Whether I understood it. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Like, but it's not going to be a debate, but it's just kind of to see like, oh, do we understand each other before we start talking? I think it's just going to be a fun conversation. And as for me, like I'm in the background, I will definitely be talking. I know myself too well for that, but my interest is mainly in Nietzsche, as most people will know, and I know that's also very important for Brandon. I know at least at some point, especially obviously like the death of God part, like what that meant and what it means to go through that, not just sort of like as a theoretical problem, but existentially, and what that means. That's been very important in my life. So therefore, I think this could be a good fit. But to see why maybe this might be a good fit, I'll start with you, Bas. Like you can say a little bit about your research. I'm just going to be calling you Bas in this conversation. And then you can bring it over to Brandon and just like say so briefly. And then after that, you can maybe summarize Brandon's take, and then he can fill you in on what he thinks you might have missed, or yeah, or would
So
work.
first a short introduction, and
Right.
then
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Brandon, and then I'll come back. Okay, good.
Sure.
Well, to be relatively short, I started off in industrial engineering and management science. You have to do something. And worked for a long time in financial management and business appraisal with PricewaterhouseCoopers, later on Pricewaterhouse. Went to South Africa when apartheid ended, went to Russia when the communism ended. So I was part of the reconstructive effort in those economies. Came back to the Netherlands to work on the railway package. That is, how do you improve railway planning across the European Union when you have so many different countries and you do really want to have railway taking away the market share from airlines. That ended with a directive, which is a different word for a European law. I brought electronic fare ticketing to the Netherlands with a team, came from Hong Kong. And then after that, I was blocked in my career and decided to do theology. I did a PhD on the Gospel of Philip, which is a Gnostic Christian gospel. And somehow, when I hear people talking about Gnostic Christianity, it's a bit disparaging in the little corner. So if anything, I'd like to sometimes show some of the nuggets in that thinking. A lot of the Neoplatonism that is part of John Vervaeke's thinking is actually discussed already in that trend. And then I taught New Testament for a while at Utrecht University. Couldn't sustain the family or my health on that because I tried too much. I tried basically to help the students both be theological and scientifically critical. And I tried to make them do exercises, but if you have 100 students and you get essays every week, that's a bit of a challenge. So I made my life difficult, and decided to do volunteers work on the one hand and management consulting and stuff like that on the other hand, and went on to the psychology of the Bible and biblical characters. There is within the Society for Biblical Literature, there's a group for that. And it ended up with me publishing on psychological analyses and the historical Jesus. After that, I worked a lot more within the family, if I may say so, because a lot of our kids have their periods in believing, non-believing, finding partners that have not been raised as Christians, and being a dad and a pastor and a theologian, and also brought up in the scientific tradition. I thought that required me to rethink how you talk about faith. So, in a nutshell.
Well said. Brendan, please go ahead. Yeah.
With a little introduction?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks. First of all, this is exciting and lovely. Nice to meet you, Bas and Aaron. There's a pleasure. So thanks for organizing this. Yeah, oh gosh, where to begin? Briefly grew up in a very conservative evangelical Christian family. Got very much into that in my teenage years. Decided to try to become a biblical studies professor, ideally aiming at like a Christian seminary, let's say, teaching Christian history, biblical studies, that sort of a thing. That became my sort of career path. Went to college and got really into biblical studies, kind of across the whole tradition, everything from, spanning the testaments, I guess you could say, the Old to the New Testaments and the intertestamental period as well. And got very fascinated by all of that. Got very deeply into that. Wrote a thesis on some developments of sort of mythic and theological framings and their roots in ancient Near Eastern tradition as they moved through Jewish apocalypticism and on into the early Christian period. And as a product of a lot of that study, kind of lost my faith, had a meaning crisis, bumped up against a very different way in which these materials were conceived, and the stories that I'd been raised with about what it all meant and where these things had come from didn't jive well with what I had learned, and there didn't seem to be any way that I could reconcile certain sort of fundamental issues that these studies had raised, despite best efforts. And so wound up then for me, very tragically, moving out of the faith, became a kind of, I guess I'd say an atheist for a while. Read a lot of Nietzsche, read a lot of a lot of things. Got very much into the arts. Well, no, I shouldn't even put it that way. I've always been very much into the arts. But what I did was, after graduating, and then because I didn't move on to seminary, I moved into an artist collective, and that was sort of a period of really intense focus on the arts and really a deepening into an understanding of the kind of Western cultural tradition, reading a lot of the Western canon and trying to make some sense of things, and doing a lot of writing and creating at that time. And through that, worked my way through a lot of kind of theological issues to the other side of atheism, where there was a sense of trying to re-engage issues of meaning as being very necessary and important, and finding the role of aesthetics as being very essential to that endeavor. I then found a degree program at Yale Divinity School called Religion and the Arts, which seemed very attractive to me. I applied other places as well, but that one seemed the best. So I then went and did that and got my master's at Yale Div in Religion and the Arts. Took a lot of wonderful courses there in theology. but some of the more memorable ones and really life influential ones were deepening my appreciation for Kierkegaard, for Dante, and exploring much more the sort of nexus between the arts and religion. I was part of what's called the Institute of Sacred Music, which is a bit of a misnomer because it actually deals with all the arts. It's sort of a special colloquium of Yale students that focus on the intersection of faith and the arts. Did a kind of thesis on that, or in that program, focusing actually on the relationship of Nietzsche and Wagner. And Aaron, I'd be curious. I don't know if you've checked out that video, but I'd love to.
No, I didn't. Like, I'm really curious to hear that it's up.
Oh,
Okay,
interesting. Yeah.
check it out.
Yeah. And so anyway, but that experience for me in divinity school was really helpful and brought together a lot of new things. Some of these things will come up, I'm sure, in this conversation, but I'm very interested in the role that creativity plays in sort of moving the God concept forward, and sort of the development of religion into what we're calling these days, I suppose, metamodernity. So that'd be a kind of brief summary of my little, experience. Yeah.
Oh yeah, thanks so much. I think that's really helpful as a starting off point. And that's, by the way, like if we have time for it, I would love to go into the creativity dimension, but I do want to start elsewhere. So like I actually had a couple of ways of framing this conversation, because I know that you've been talking like about, let's say, metamodern spirituality, metamodern religion, metamodern Christianity. So sort of different ways of sort of capturing different aspects of what you're working on, and that you've been, let's say, tested, challenged, I'm not sure, like you've been questioned about this specifically religious or spiritual or Christian part, where people are like, well, I hear all of you, like everything you're saying, but I'm not sure if this is Christian, right? Do you have some people like sort of responding that way, or
Yep.
I don't, like, is it really spiritual? Is it really religious? And then you had a conversation with Nate Heil, who was like, no, I'm asking where's the meta, not so much.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And I think one thing that would be interesting for me to frame is kind of to go literally in the middle, is like, and this will be a surprise to many people, but maybe like, where is the modern? Because obviously, like, there's a modern approach, because that's kind of what you're vouching for, to go like through the modern by means of beyond the modern by means of the modern, I think. And I think like someone like my father, as he just sort of laid out, like Bas has kind of been working with himself in the historical critical approach. So for him, like the modern dimension is very prominent, and in a way that I even hear brought up sort of far more than I do sometimes in your videos. So therefore, I thought it would be sort of an interesting test case to hear maybe the conversation between you two, and to see like maybe at some point later during this conversation you have some questions for him. But to start off, I want him to sort of frame your own project, and then I'll see if I can maybe fill in what I think, if I think he missed anything, and then you can fill in like the last remaining bits. Cool. And see if we misrepresented you, just so we can see if we sort of agree on some fundamental things, so we don't mess things up. So Bas, if you'd like to start, what do you think Brendan's project is, specifically surrounding the question of metamodern Christianity?
So here you betray the fact that you're a teacher of philosophy.
A little bit, maybe, yeah.
And put me on the road to say, well, you're going to have this festival, this Breakwater festival. You should talk about metamodern spirituality and Brendan's project. And I said, the what? So last few days, I've watched a few videos. I've not read your book. I'm sorry about that. Couldn't get hold of it that quickly. I also watched a few videos with Tim Vermeulen. And I found out that basically there are different ways of looking at that term metamodern. And I think it's important to lay that out first. So Tim and Robin started with a project to describe the feel, especially in the art galleries. And what they saw happening in the, well, say 2008, etc., at the time that Obama was coming up, and maybe a lot of optimism there, they saw a different mood than a postmodern mood. It was not just critiquing modernism anymore. There was a type of, and they used the word oscillation, between the modern and the postmodern, and a sort of neo-romantic longing. And I thought in one of the clips he talked about the shopping mall as the ultimate modern structure. and then hearing sounds and not knowing if it's the air conditioning or someone from the outside knocking to get in, and what kind of mythic structures then come into existence if people work with that. And then I saw other people moving on with making it a political project. The Hansi Freinacht book, which I briefly perused. I mean, I haven't been able to read it in full, but the sentence struck me like saying, we'll take the best of modernism and the best of postmodernism and make our metamodernism. That would be a really different way of looking at it than the Tim Vermeulen part, because as Tim said, I guess in a conversation with you, Brendan, even Donald Trump is metamodern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The best
Because
of
if you use it as a
the
description
best
of the
modernism.
mood of the times, that's different from when you use it as a more of a normative or prescriptive way. And when I hear you talk, it seems with you it's more a Hegelian scheme, that you say, well, there's a thesis, modernism, there's an antithesis, postmodernism, and now we're trying to find a new way, and we can't go back.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's essential in your thinking. You are synthetic in a sense that you want to move on, you want to make something better. But we cannot simply, as some of the guys in this little corner are doing, going back to the Orthodox churches, disregarding the nationalism as element in those churches, and simply go back to mysticism and pre-modern ways of expressing your faith. And I think you're right in that. I think even those who do that cannot escape the world that they live in. And that world has gone through modernism and has gone through postmodernism and is finding its bearings somehow now, no longer in a sort of denial of modernism and simply critiquing it, but also longing for something that is called meaning. Now, in that process, what has troubled me a little bit, you use Fowler's stages of faith, and you use words like we must and we have to get rid of the miracles and stuff like that. And I had a preacher on that course for a long time here in the church. And I asked him one day, I said, can you have faith while believing these miracles? Can people who are still stuck in phase 2 benefit from the symbolic preaching that you give them? And then he had to think a little while, because I added the word, it feels a bit normative to me when I talked about he also used Fowler. And then he waited for a while, and then he said, yeah, I guess you're right. And then I said, so, okay, so what is the project now? Are we trying to help people to develop a healthy spirituality in this time? And that's different for people who are different, who have different challenges, like Maimonides in Egypt. He talked about philosophy not being the only way, because he needed religion as well for the whole people of the Jews. So that's an interesting way of looking at it. And what are your challenges in life, and how do you develop a healthy spirituality? So coming from there, I was looking at your project, and I thought, well, this is interesting. He's really trying to come to terms with modern voices, and your talks with Lehman and Vervaeke are beautiful to listen to, and I really think they are very inspiring. On the other hand, you're sometimes also on a mission to explain to people why the pre-modern understanding has to be left behind. And that's a question that I will have for you, is to what extent is that really necessary? And to what extent can we allow people to come to terms with their own challenges and then respond to it? So as a Steelman argument and a question then.
So then in that case also I won't, like, I can fill it in further, maybe emphasize some of the historical critical methods, and that the fact that this little corner sometimes, like, it does the postmodern trick and then sort of picks a narrative. Like, so there are other elements, I think, to this story, but I think really the crux is there. So I'll just allow you to, well, first of all, say if you think it's a more or less adequate characterization, and what your response will be to the question, Brandon.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks, guys. So yeah, I think you hit a lot of really important issues in that framing, and I'm happy to offer kind of my thinking, my responses to some of those. It's there's so much, it's a little bit difficult to, in the context of any podcast or even a book to try to, you know, cover what needs to be covered in some of this. But I heard a couple of things that I would love to fill in a little bit. One is the different metamodernisms that you named, the different kind of aspects of what that word has been used to convey. Then the issue of sort of Fowler and sort of developmental framings of faith, and how we engage that from a sort of normative or prescriptive approach. If that is, what are the limitations or the problems with that? Something like that is sort of at least two things that I'd love to fill in there. The speaking to the various metamodern aspects is something I do in my book. So I'd love to maybe have another conversation if and when you do check that out, because what I attempted to do in that book was to look at the different ways that people were using this term and to try to synthesize them. Okay, so yeah, the term shows up in 2010 with the paper by Vermeulen and Van Donneker in Notes on Metamodernism. And then and I was actually a part of that movement. I was, yeah, at the Stedelijk Museum and for that event, and I was part of the first Metamodernism in the Humanities conference that happened in Scotland in 2014. And so from pretty early on phase of that kind of discourse, I've been involved with it. But then I've also seen the other directions that it's gone, that it's taken. So after that, you get Hansi Freinach's book, which, as you say, does some new and different things with the term. And one of the key aspects that they bring to the conversation is a more developmental framing of looking at it more through the lens of a kind of Hegelian dialectical process, or what they call real dialectique, that there's some kind of a creative aspect going on in culture and in the relationship between kind of the human psychological development and cultural evolution, that there's some process there that they're trying to name. And as you do that, you move from the pre-modern to the modern to the postmodern to the metamodern. So that very much extends and expands and takes in new directions, let's say, what that term means, in a way that's still playing out in the discourse. I mean, you have people in the cultural studies camp who are getting very frustrated with the Hansi Freinach people and all that. So so it's a contested term, and ways of theorizing what we mean by metamodern and metamodernity are, there's now a layering to that, at least. So by the time you get to 2017, right, you've got the early cultural studies stuff, and then you get the Hansi Freinach stuff. Then you get in 2021, I believe, Jason Storm's work, Metamodernism, or no, what does he call it? Metamodernism, the Future of Theory, which is a very brilliant systematic philosophy. In fact, Aaron, I'd love to get your take on that. If you've read it, it'd be really interesting. And now this guy is coming from a totally different angle. He's aware of the other folks, but he's also trying to do something that's specifically responding to sort of the research paradigm of postmodernism, as it is kind of, it's sort of in the hegemonic, dominant role in academia, and feeling like there are diminishing returns there and sort of a limit, and trying to move beyond it. But what's interesting in my reading and in others is that there's a lot of profound similarities and overlaps between what he's saying and some of the things that Hansi's saying and some of the things that the cultural studies folks are saying. There was another book called Metamodernity by Lena Rachel Anderson, also in the Nordic countries, and she's done a lot of work exploring, she wrote a book called The Nordic Secret and that sort of thing, very interested in Bildung and education. Anyway, she's subsequently now calling her work polymodernism, to try to differentiate from some of the confusion, as you know, as these different metamodernisms have proliferated. But in any event, when I saw this happen over the course of this decade or so, these people all grappling with various forms of a metamodernism, and I just tried to read them all sort of synoptically and see, what are the comparisons, what's the overlap, and what are the differences. Yeah, I felt like there were profound similarities. And so this book that I've written, Metamodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Cultural Logics, is an attempt to try to consider what these are all gesturing to in their kind of synthetic form, and then go through the different iterations, the philosophy, the cultural studies, the developmental and complexity angles, and try to say, what's the gestalt here? Like, what are because some people will want to say, oh, they're just using the same term, but this is actually something very different. But I don't think that's accurate. I think that there is actually this thing emerging called metamodernity, and we're all kind of touching one part of the elephant. And so that book is an attempt to try to bring those things together. So I mentioned all that partly just to name the fact. Whoop. Oh, sorry. my window disappeared for a second.
Oh, okay. We see
okay.
you.
Okay, good. Oh no, I thought I disappeared. So all that was just an attempt to take very seriously a lot of the diversity in this field, and to try to find a way that we could also speak about metamodernism or metamodernity in a way that I felt is honestly engaging with all of these as a kind of coherent paradigm. So, and we can, that all being said, we can dig into that, and we can also get into the differences as they are relevant. But I do think that there's a there to the metamodern. Now I do think, and that the sort of, how would you say, dialectical or the developmental framing of this that comes in a very big way with the Hansi Freinacht stuff, but which I see as also playing out in other forms of metamodernism. That does, for me, speak to something very important about one of the aspects of the metamodern, which is that, it's always a challenge to consider where we want to dig in and what we want to draw out of this. But there's some element to which the postmodern relativizes things in a way that loses meta narratives, grand histories, things like that, and normativity, and issues of value and that sort of a thing.
Sincerity, right? Yeah.
Sincerity, and also a sense that that there's any way to adjudicate between perspectives, let's say, something like that. Whereas if we're moving beyond the postmodern, and there's some element to which this metamodern thing has elements of both the postmodern and the modern, which again is something that you see across all these different framings. One of the things that does return is this qualified notion of progress or change in a direction, right? And in a way that, in postmodernism, when people say, like Lyotard, they're like, it's the incredulity of meta narratives, and that we have to kind of give up on any of these notions of development or progress. Some of that returns in the metamodern framing, I think, in an important way. And one way of thinking about that is, the sense that things do build on each other, that somehow the modern is responding to, building upon the pre-modern, reflecting upon it, objectifying it, critiquing it, and trying to transcend it. And then in turn, the postmodern is doing the same thing with the modern, and then the metamodern to the postmodern. And if you take that kind of development seriously, there's something going on there, and that something is a big question for metamodern framing. So at the very least, we get some sense of progression or development. Things aren't just radically relative; they have a trajectory to them. And so,
can I ask a brief question for
yeah, by all means.
So how would it would it be somewhat similar to, let's say, how Hegel viewed history, how Marx viewed history, in terms of like, okay, we're trying to feel where this is going, but it's clear that it's progressing. It's kind of like, in that sense, like, are there differences there? Obviously, like, there's differences in terms of focus, but you know what I mean? Like the general picture. No.
I think one of the crucial differences is that both of those folks that you named, and of course, Marx was profoundly influenced by Hegel, right? Both of those folks are, I would say, grand narrative thinkers in the modern vein. And one of the things that marks out their modernist kind of association or proclivities is that they project a sort of final telos, right? That there's one particular aim that we are all moving towards. And, in Hegel, it's absolute spirit. In Marx, it's this classless, utopian society. But there's some sense in which, history is a linear progression, and we're going to get somewhere. And when we get somewhere, then, then it's
historically
done.
It's a very Christian thing. The whole
it
thing
is, and yeah, and certainly I'm very keen to emphasize that I think a lot of this this modern progress narrative is in many ways a development on pre-modern Christian eschatology. So I think that's very fair. But one of the things that then, when the postmoderns come around, they critique that. right? And they say, nope, doesn't work that way. And it's sort of like whose story, whose narrative, whose aim, all that stuff. And they also say that, well, hey, wait a second, you know, the linear progression of history seemed to have led us to two massive world wars that led to genocide and, you know, and the Gulag, all these things, right? So the notion of progress gets fundamentally undermined in this sense. And I do believe that there's something in the metamodern discourse that wants to return some semblance of progression to history, but not in the naive modern sense of like a Hegel or a Marx, because I think the metamodern suggestion would be we're moving somewhere, but it's a kind of continually receding horizon. And I was actually really, I found it
that's the
fascinating.
process part that you're talking about.
Yeah,
Also.
yeah. And so things are in development, they're ongoing. We live in a state of flux and becoming, and we never reach the ultimate level of being or the ultimate telos, but there is a directionality to it. And for Moylan and von Doniker talk about the carrot stick, you know, we're like on a donkey that has a carrot in front of it, and we're kind of always heading into the horizon. Of course, Hansi Freinacht and folks talk about, you know, there is this real dialectic to history, but I think that that's a very important aspect. I call it infinitesimal progress, right? It's like, what does progress mean in an infinite frame? It's sort of, or I also call it Zenonian progress in the kind of Zeno's paradox sense, right? Like you can always keep cutting in half. And so what does it mean to move ahead? But there's a qualified sense of progress and development. So anyway, I'll shut up in a second. The last point I want to make is just that when you take a frame like that seriously and you get back some sense in which there is unfolding and accretive development, then other ways of seeing things that draw on more developmental frameworks become more amenable and more attractive. And so you do wind up finding the attraction to stage theories and to various kinds of developmental thought in metamodernism that I think makes a lot of sense. And so one of those would be Fowler's stages of faith. And one way I would say more broadly, as kind of generalizing from that specific, is that you can think of faith itself as undergoing a process of development or unfolding or accretive self-reflection. And when you look at it that way, you can actually look at the progression from the pre-modern to the modern to the postmodern to the metamodern as being things that build one on the other, that try to integrate the insights of what's come before, but also transcend them. And so you actually do get a sense in which whatever metamodern Christianity, let's say, is, it somehow moved through the modern and the postmodern, and of course, obviously the pre-modern, to be where it is in a way that somehow is including aspects of what's come before, but is also moved beyond them in some ways. And so that is something that I do think is an important aspect, at least for the project that I'm engaged in. And then we can talk about what are the merits and demerits, which I didn't get into in this response because I was just sort of filling out more of that picture.
You cannot do everything.
Yeah. So anyway, I'll pause there and we can,
Okay.
Yeah, it would be fun to give you a very postmodern response to it. Although I must say it was a response I had before postmodernism arrived at the scene. Growing a bit older, of course, you sometimes see things and then you say, we saw that before. One of the things I've done is go back in history, go back to prehistoric times, go back to evolution, etc. And I think that the real difference between plants and animals is that animals need a reason to move forward. That is basically pre-Aristotelian understanding of what the meaning of the soul was in the first place. So the psyche in Aristotle gets expanded to mean something like a life force, but he needs to argue because it also entails growth, and growth is also a sort of movement. But that's because his predecessor said it's movement. It's the appetite to want to move to a better place. So all animals, and as we are, say, rather advanced animals, but still animals, all animals are built to want to move forward to a better place. That is our yearning for meaning also. And the more that we are able to also be spiritual beings, we can sort of travel through place and time within our spirit. That whole yearning for meaning takes on the shape that we have today. And postmodernism, although it was right in its critique, didn't provide that satisfaction that we need as we are animals, as we are ensouled beings. Literally, animal means ensouled beings, of course. So the nature of the soul in any animal not in the plans. That's why I differ with Aristotle. I think it's an innovation that wasn't helpful. But that nature has something of wanting to move forward. At the same time, there's a nostalgia. And when we look at the late antiquity at the different cultures, many cultures were driven by nostalgia. So there was a golden age.
Mm-hmm.
And it was somewhat in Judaism, somewhat present in, I would say, Pharisaic Judaism. Not so much in Sadduceic Judaism, but in Pharisaic Judaism, there was a sense of moving forward. And that got transferred into the eschatology of Christianity. And then but this is one of the big themes, of course, of the New Testament. This sort of motivated the movement. So the fact that you present a narrative about moving forward towards a promised land, even though the promised land is always receding.
Mm-hmm.
So the interesting thing about when you read the New Testament from the perspective of the authors, and you start with Thessalonians, our earliest writings, then you see a very immediate coming of the Lord. The eschatology is small and it's immediate. Mm-hmm. And it gets bigger and bigger. And when you end up with the Johannine literature, it is all encompassing. The whole heavens and earth are to be changed. So you see, as it's receding, it's also growing. Mm. And that's a fascinating story. I mean, if you understand what's going on with these people, they are developing an engine mm-hmm. to sort of create societal change. And that still goes on. And I think that the whole wokeness thing and the whole metamodernity is actually, I think in 100 years' time, we will see postmodernism simply as a step towards, again, picking up mm-hmm. where we as animals are supposed to be, looking forward.
Yeah. No, I agree with all that. There's so many things I could plug into, but for the time's sake, I would want to say, so yes, I agree. I mean, there's a little quibble I would want to make about plants because they also have reasons they just can't move. And so Greg Enriquez's whole Utah thing is really good for this in terms of like, I think you can trace meanings kind of all the way down. And this gets into some other aspects of my work, which I won't bring up here now, but I totally agree with the thrust of your argument. And then what I would want to, what's that?
That's probably the Whiteheadian kind of like analysis, right?
There's an aspect of that. There's dissipative structures and thermodynamics and all this stuff. But the point is, yes, we have reasons, we have motivations, things that orient us towards goal states that we are moving towards, and you can see eschatology, I guess, as a form of that thinking. One of the connections I'd love to make, and then get your thoughts on this, Bas, is like, when a big part of my project, I guess you could say, is that if we move from a kind of pre-modern to modern to postmodern to metamodern framing of religion, spirituality, and specifically Christianity, then there's this movement that happens when we get to the modern, where we have to then grapple with that historical critical stuff that Aaron mentioned earlier, that this is a thing I'm trying to inject in a real way that we need to take seriously. Because if we're going to get here, we've got to move through here. And if right here you get to historical critical scholarship, then you've got to somehow move through that and beyond it into a phase of a Christianity that somehow integrates those insights, even as it doesn't necessarily fall into the cul-de-sacs of some modern or liberal theology, let's say. And so for me, that's a big part of it, is like this shift of mentality and perspective that happens when you move into the 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s, and people then are doing the kind of work that you and I have both studied, probably you, if you've got a PhD, much more so, where you're really getting into the texts and dating them and recognizing, oh, this is, pseudepigraphic, and oh, this must have been written at this time. And you start doing the historical critical study of these things in a way that winds up departing the narrative further from the traditional devotional lens on these texts, which is to say, maybe a bit naively, that, oh, well, Moses wrote the Torah and, Isaiah wrote Isaiah. When you start critically scrutinizing them, you realize all the other things that are going on there. And for me, I feel that a very robust Christianity is possible on the other side of these insights. But I also experience a lot of pushback from people who maybe are still grappling with the implications of a lot of this stuff. That's kind of the framing with context or with relation to metamodernism. But my question for you then would be, how do you relate these things. What is your thinking about this? Because you have studied these things, and so what do you think is the proper way of integrating the insights of like historical critical scholarship and retaining a robust faith?
Yeah, I think the historical critical project sort of lost its bearings when people who were doing it no longer understood what faith was.
Mm.
I'm a bit harsh here. I'm not harsh about Bultmann, for instance. I mean, when you read the little book on Jesus that Bultmann wrote, that's a very, very religious book.
Mm.
And he understands that that's where he wants to be. But the whole project is a very modern project, the whole Protestant project. I mean, I gave students the assignment. I had two books on the New Testament, one by a Catholic priest and one by Bart Ehrman, as it was the most popular introduction to the New Testament. And I asked the students to take a look at the books, to research the lives of these people a little bit, and to come back with an analysis of what was the same and what was different, and whether or not they had an inkling of why. That was a shocker to them. They said, "Are you giving us books that are not true?" That was the postmodern in me. I want them to be, I had to develop a critical habitus, as they say in Latin. So I had to make them critically aware of the power structures embedded in any text, whether a religious text or a scientific text. And for instance, when we come to the New Testament, I think that a background of faith helps you tremendously to understand people of faith. But you also have to be academic. You also have to be able to work your way through the evidence and use the scientific method. It's not that difficult, but you have to be you have to engage in scientific doubt. If you don't do that, you're not getting anywhere.
It's kind of like,
unfortunately, the project has been hijacked a few times.
Make one comparison. Just check if that
Go ahead.
works, so I could see if the viewers also understand this. So like, let's say, you know, you're an art critic, you know. If you're an art critic and you don't love art, for instance, like, you know the difference, right? And but art critics who love art, like, there's something about hearing them talk about art that it's like, yes, you're keeping it alive. But if you're an art critic and you know what you're talking about, at the same time, do you really? Because you don't actually appreciate what you're looking at.
Yeah.
Is that a fair comparison, or is this? Yeah.
I think that's an excellent comparison.
Okay, good. Then
because you know, this material is not only Origen would say you would have the flesh of the text, the soul of the text, and the spirit of the text. And he was an excellent text critic. And he knew about historical criticism. He would go to Palestine and figure out whether it was Gergesa, Gerasa, or Gadara being meant in the text, because he said, well, our copies of Matthew suck. I mean, they're really bad because they were not made by professionals. So he knew that, and he took time to curate the documents and then to go on the ground and see what they could have meant. And that he would call the flesh of the text. And then he would move on to the soul of the text, which would be the moral meaning. So does it encourage us? Does it challenge us? Does it comfort us? And then after you have exhausted the text in that way, he would go to the spiritual meaning. That means, does it lift you up? Does it let you see something grander that you could not put words to? Now, I think that is such a fuller understanding of how I would like to do Bible studies. Biblical studies should be both the flesh, should be historical critical. It should be both the morality. It should be appealing to what is a good life, but it should also be spiritual. And I think sometimes the very Protestant project of engaging with the truth and human pride, being more critical than the guy before you, sort of derailed the project at times, that we lost that picture. Because if we take the picture of Origen, I never had a problem studying theology, but I was not raised in a fundamentalist way. I read the Bible on my own as a young boy from age 13, and I saw that Moses didn't write the Torah. Of course, you can read it in the text. It's there. His death is being described, so it's not that difficult. On the other hand, you also see that there are remarks there that says, well, he wrote down in clay, in chalk underneath a rock these and these texts. So you see, as a young reader, wow, although my pastor was talking about, of course, all the modern theories, because that's the church I grew up in, I see that there's old stuff there. Wonderful. I just don't know what part of it is very old and what not.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, that's just growing up. And growing up as a person means also finding what faith does for you, how you're being comforted, how you are being led, how you're being given that telos.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can recognize that same process with the people impacted by Jesus, we just like as with Socrates, we don't have any words from Jesus himself. So we only have the testimonies of people impacted by him.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of the connection you get with these people that leads you, I think, to very healthy spirituality.
So wait, so I want to
I'll
add
stop
one
here.
thing. No, yeah, but I do want to add one thing before Brandon responds, because I think actually there might be a lot of overlap. I think Brandon will, well, he'll speak to that obviously, but he might agree with that, let's say, the sentiment you put out. But I think what's important, like having listened to some of Brandon's discussion about this, is that essentially if I sort of frame your position correctly, Brandon, that you want to, get beyond the modern by means of the modern. So essentially, so for instance, an example would be is you look at the historical critical stuff, you find out that what's written there actually shows that, it didn't actually happen the way we think it happens in the Bible, and therefore eventually, like by means of it, so not disregarding it, but by means of it, we should arrive at the conclusion that, oh, it doesn't matter. Like, it's not so relevant that Jesus was a historical person. Like, it would be equally, like, even if he was, as you already pointed out, like, that shouldn't be relevant. And there's a part of the truth that I wholeheartedly sort of agree with. I brought it up with my dad previously, that I heard Justin Brierley say at some point in a conversation when he was asked, like, yeah, what would make you an atheist? And he said, like, well, I guess, yeah, if the bones of Jesus were found somewhere. And I thought that answer was profoundly lacking, that I was like, really? Really? Like, that would make you, like, for some reason, I was like, okay, that's interesting. Or what would make you doubt the resurrection or something like that?
Mhm.
But so what I think is interesting, and that's why I want to get your response, is that I think for my dad, for Bas, like, it's clear that he values all the historical stuff,
Mhm.
but he thinks that it does matter, but not in a way like, like, oh, we have to hold on and we have to like dogmatically say what
Yeah.
actually happened, but more so like in a spirit that appreciates it and can kind of sort of play with it, but also takes it
Mhm.
very seriously, but doesn't move to the position where it says like, so therefore we can now see that it doesn't matter. Whereas I think you do want to get to that position, but maybe I'm misframing your position. So I'll allow you to respond to all of this,
Well, yeah. So to be clear, I obviously wouldn't be emphasizing the historical critical evidence so much if I didn't think it didn't matter, right? I think it matters profoundly. I
Yeah.
think what is the challenge is that people feel like that sentiment you just shared of that thinker who said that if the bones of Jesus were found, that would do it, right?
Yeah.
That to me shows, as you say, that there's something lacking in the understanding of what this is all about. Which is to say that if for that person, an answer like that reveals that the history almost is everything, you know, and so I do believe that when you move through the historical critical method, that way of seeing things falls apart. Um, and so if there is going to be a robust Christianity on the other side of that, it's got to be able to deal with those insights. Now, what Bus is talking about is a really, I think, a very rich way of looking at this. Bus, you've had the privilege, I guess you could say, of having grown up in a kind of thoroughly modernized church where you're like, you take that for granted, and then you go and try to look for that spiritual depth in the text. In the tradition that I'm from and in the country that I live in, the modernization of Christianity is far from being taken for granted. I would say on the whole, it hasn't occurred yet. And so most of Christianity in America is pre-modern in nature. It recoils from the notion that the history is different from it recoils from the notion that the Bible isn't history. right? Is that one of the deep problems is that people are deeply modernized in America, clearly, but their religion isn't at that level. And so they tend to assume that the stories they read in the Bible are history, the same way that, like, if you read a biography of JFK, these are the same kind of thing. And then when you present them with the fact, with all the evidence to the contrary, they will want to say that it's bad scholarship, that that's false, that it's missing the point and whatever. They will do everything they can to deny any of that. And so that's what I'm trying to help people move through. So I think you are in the position, Bas, of having already, that those things weren't an issue because you were already kind of set up to go that deeper level. And that's the deeper level that I think people can get to. And it's not to say that history doesn't matter. It matters a lot. We need to take the history seriously, but we have to appreciate that the Bible isn't strict history. We have to appreciate all the other aspects that are going on there. And that, that's that sort of developmental thing that I'm trying to speak to. And so, what can happen sometimes though, is that, that people like you, Bas, who are talking about this from this perspective of, it's not about the history. You got to dig into the text and see the spiritual reading and all this stuff. You can say those things and it will land for someone over here who hasn't gone through any of the modernization at all and say, see, the history doesn't matter and the modern stuff doesn't matter because it's about the spirit. And you're actually having different conversations, because if you were to ask this person, they would give an answer like what Aaron was quoting the other person is saying, is that somehow if this didn't all pan out exactly the way the Bible text says, then their faith is worthless. The other thing I would throw in there too, which is an interesting element, is that, and I'm sorry, Aaron, who was the person that said that? What was
Justin Brierley? Like, he's a famous host of the Unbelievable podcast, and like he's a very Christian person who always brought atheists and Christians together. Yeah.
So the interesting thing is that
surprising rebirth of Christianity, the
surprising rebirth of belief in God. I think.
Believe in God.
I've seen
that's what he's working on right now. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I've seen that floating
very
around
nice
YouTube.
series, by the way.
Well, that's interesting. But I mean, but what's interesting about that though is that I think that for folks more in that camp, you could actually show them the bones of Jesus and they wouldn't believe it. They just wouldn't, right? So it's not even a matter of what would make them an atheist, because there is an element to which when you inhabit a worldview, you are so primed to reject evidence that would impinge upon that worldview that you would do anything to negate that. So anyway, that's kind of the big point. I think that's kind of the crux of the whole project, is that there is a Christianity beyond this stuff and this way of thinking. And this is where the Fowler stuff comes back in, right? Because, people are going to be engaging the text from a mythic, literal perspective. And in America, I'd say, again, most probably Christianity is from that lens. Maybe in Europe, and especially in the Netherlands, it's already mostly from like an individual reflective lens. So you've already moved, through a couple
you
things.
have to deal with it. That's more of it. I mean, I thought it was a bit, you went through the miracles at one point in time, where I think we can do a little to and fro about what elements would be helpful, because I'm a big fan of historicity. And the historicity for me is the experience of those people, of Paul. I mean, when we read Paul, we're in the middle of a struggle to create communities of faith that cross borders. These are historical documents. These are not narratives. These are letters written in the thick of the fight. Of course, not all of the letters, but we are pretty much in agreement about a number of these letters, even though we do not know exactly how the Pauline canon came to be. But at least we agree that this is material from the thick of the fight. Like Ezekiel is. I mean, there are a few of those writings that are thoroughly historical. And it's interesting that if you go through miracles, you should start, in my opinion, with what's going on in these communities. And then we go to the narrative material, because the narrative material expresses how these communities communicate about their experiences. So for me, I'm not that much of a fan, to be honest, to compare, say, the study of the Torah with its 1,000-year Genesis with the study of the New Testament, which most of it spends about 50 years or something. It's a complete. I mean, I know that the early German critics, they thought that the Gospels were written somewhere around 150. They needed that because they were comparing it to Kleinkunst, like the German brothers Grimm, the fairy tales, etc. And they needed all these explanations about how they came to be. What the modernists need to understand, I've lived in Africa for a while, is that healings are very real spiritual healings. That you've, of course, read Graham 12.3 and others on the miracles of Jesus. But the point is, we're not looking for miracles that are impossible, because if they're impossible, they didn't happen. We're looking something that is miracle is something that is worthy to behold. And those things do happen. So I firmly believe that the historical Jesus had an impact on people that led to a number of healings.
Yeah.
I think the historical record is absolutely clear there.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Thoroughly believe that the followers of Jesus thought they had experienced him alive. There's not much disagreement among serious biblical scholars about that.
Do you mean alive after the resurrection or before? Like, what do you mean?
After the resurrection.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
The point is then, how do the narrative stories frame the nature of the resurrection? That's the second question. But the first question is a experience of faith. And if we focus on the materiality only, and if historical criticism is doing that, then it's lacking the most important thing that we're reading about in the letters of Paul. That is, there are communities coming into existence that experience the spiritual presence of the Lord in those communities at that point in time.
And if I can, I'd like to make a little bit of an addendum to kind of draw this sort of into a larger picture, where it's like sometimes you watch, let's say, a slightly fictionalized version of something that happened in real life, like, I don't know, like a historical battle, like something like that. And there's something about that where you're like, I do appreciate that this speaks to a reality that occurred. So in some sense, like, there's something about that which matters. And on the other hand, I also obviously agree that that doesn't mean that, I don't know, for instance, the Lord of the Rings is bullshit and, it's because it didn't actually happen. It's like, so there's something about historical reality that we shouldn't just sort of discount in a way, like, oh, like, and eventually it's all stories. But I don't think you want to go there, Brandon, so I'll actually allow you to respond.
No, this is good stuff. So I mean, to pick up that last point you were just mentioning, Aaron, like, I just watched The King with Timothée Chalamet which is it's really interesting because it's about Henry V. And of course, Shakespeare wrote, not just Henry V, but also Henry IV parts 1 and 2. And so there's this, like, there are the Shakespeare plays that deal with this. And in some ways, this movie is based on those Shakespeare plays, but it's not trying to be those plays at all. It's just trying to, like, tell the story of Henry V and Agincourt and all this stuff. And so Falstaff is actually a character, but in a very different way than the Shakespeare plays. And so there's just interesting ways in which, think about this. You've got the historical events that happened. Then you get, like, people writing the history of those events, and they're probably, who knows what's going on in that. And then you get Shakespeare basing his plays off of the history, and then you get a movie basing, and at the kernel of all of that is something that happened. And it was something, in the sense that you're using the word, was rather miraculous. The English army is sort of outnumbered, but they have this kind of miraculous win, and then there was some, something really cool happened there. And when I read Shakespeare or I watch The King or whatever, I'm somehow engaging with the thing that happened. And that is somehow also still present there. And there's a kind of, clearly it's a gift that keeps giving, right? There's a kind of fecundity to the importance of it.
Feels relevant, right?
Like, it does. And we keep making it relevant too, right?
It becomes ever more relevant as we build layer upon layer. I mean, this is your progressive idea, of course.
Yes.
I mean, it gets richer and richer.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, though, but here's the thing, right? Then it's about, like, appreciating all of that is the important thing that I want people to become conscious of. Because if someone watches The King and then they say, oh, now I know what happened at Agincourt, be like, whoa, wait a second. that's based off of a Shakespeare play, that's based off the history, that's based, right? So it's like, was Falstaff even a human being that ever lived? Actually, probably not, right? And in fact, his name gets changed from in Shakespeare's play. You can look at the history of all that, right? But it's like profoundly not the point, and it's profoundly a more limited engagement with not only the material, but whatever that historical thing is that happened. It's limited by trying to fix that thing as like, no, the king has to be the canonical, right, accurate depiction of what happened. And I'm just trying to get people to like see all this other stuff. And and you know, and some of that can be a little bit painful because, like, man, if you love that movie and you love the way it handled that event, then yeah, maybe it's going to be a little like frustrating to learn, oh, actually it didn't quite pan out that way and all this stuff, right? But then once you get past that, you do tend to enrich your understanding of all of this by appreciating all the layers involved. And that's the sort of Christianity that I want people to be engaging with, that it's not just, oh, then Jesus met, you know, Jairus and he healed his daughter, and then that happened. It's like, well, wait a second. When we expand our whole scope of this, it's like, this is a kind of story, and it's trying to communicate X, Y, and Z, and there are other kinds of stories, and the story isn't here, but it doesn't matter. And that's what I mean by the history doesn't matter. That's what I'm getting at, right? Clearly the history matters, but those works aren't about the history per se, and they don't, the richness doesn't come through because of the history, even though there is this historical kernel that is of importance there. So go ahead.
No, I would just add to like, so like I'm still struggling. Like I'm kind of like I very much appreciate sort of the way you've been framing this, and at the same time I know like that if you obviously read the Old Testament, that it's all about that celebration of history, right? Like it's all about, okay, now we need to celebrate that we made the move out of Egypt. So there's something about them saying like it's really important that we all realize this happened. So, and that's obviously laid out, and that's kind of like what Bas was also talking about previously. There's this tradition that sort of builds up. And I'd say in a similar way, like obviously like, well, I was obviously raised religiously, but then I also had my doubts at some point, and definitely also had a strong like atheistic phase for a while. But my point was also like that when I was first doubting and kind of coming to terms with it, it was obviously very nice that I could always ask my dad a question about these things. But then I was like, oh wait, so did this really happen, or did this not really happen? And first of all, he helped me to reframe that question in the sense of that usually people say like, so it all happened, but maybe sometimes it's symbolic. And he said like, well, just think of it differently. Think like it's always symbolic, and maybe sometimes it really happened, and that's really exciting, and that really helped me out. And then I was also thinking like specifically my concerns with, let's say, some of these, let's say, historical accuracy concerning Jesus' own life. I can say, and I'm still figuring out whether or not this is like, what do you call it, like a desperate holding on to some kind of historical reality. And I'm not saying you frame it that way. I'm just asking myself if that's the case, or if it's in some sense healthy that I'm affirmed that some of the core things about, let's say, Christ, Jesus, the historical figure, are affirmed in the most recent, most critical scholarship, at least presented to me by my dad, because obviously I can't assess that myself. And that it's not just said like, oh, actually, you know, like, so for me, the critical insight as related by my father, which again, like it's a specific medium, but helped me to appreciate like, oh, all the core stuff about Jesus did happen, you know, like all the very important relevant stuff, and that indeed like there's side stuff, and then we can, you know, that's where you obviously get the Dan Brown and like Mary, like what do you call it, Mary Magdalene type stuff, and all those conspiracy type thinking, and that's fine. Like I don't mind that, you know, there's discussions about that, but the core stuff, I do think I care that it happened in some ways, but maybe you're not discounting that. I'm not sure who I should give the word now, because I feel like both of you have something to respond to at this point. Yeah.
Well, I spoke last, so Bas, if you'd like to go.
Oh, okay, good. Well, I think a very good example is the storm. I think you mentioned it once in one of your videos, and you went to Babylonian conceptions of why that story would be relevant. That would contribute to the resonance of the story. I would agree with that. I wouldn't, however, agree with the fact that that was the original setting. Are you aware of the work of Mendel Nun? No. Okay. Mendel Nun was a Jewish refugee, went to Israel before the war, actually. He went on to be an archaeologist and a fisherman from the Ein Gev kibbutz. And he was studying the history of the Lake of Galilee, and he found out that many of the stories in the Gospels actually helped him tremendously to put flesh to what was happening. And one of the interesting things is that the whole narrative within Mark, set within Mark, about the different miracles of the fishing miracles, he could actually tell me, through his writings, what went on. For instance, you've got the Tapcha miracle. Tapcha means the Capernaum miracle where you've got the fishing. Now, Tapcha comes from the Greek heptapegon, means 7 different streams came together there and created a warmer place in the winter. And he said it was quite common that shoals of fish would gather there, and that because of the warming of the water. And then he said that the storm were quite normal, and then you read that the storms, and then you read that there were several boats coming from Tiberias all the way to the other side of the lake. He says that's probably the sardine fishing season, because at Wadi Samak across, that's near Gergesa, you would have the sardines, and that's very much like the sardine run that you can still watch on YouTube, and then you've got all places in the world where all the sardines gather to create offspring, and then all the other fish come after them to hunt them. And he said the first you would have the sardines over there, and the fishermen would come during the night to get early enough to that place. And afterwards you would have the barbels, the bearded predator fish, and they would try to eat as much as possible. And then you would use a different net. And then he was explaining the different nets that you would be using. And those nets that was a seine net, S-E-Y-N-E, and those would have to be drawn from the countryside, from the shore. And then that would have to be drawn in. And that would require the least experienced people to stand on the land, whereas the more experienced would lift up the nets across the boulders in the water. And that is exactly where they would meet the guy, the demoniac guy. So what he does is he puts a very precise seasonal date. It's not a date in a year, but it's a date in the season that fits exactly with the story in Mark. Gets a number of the details that are technical so right that it tells me that, wow, the original setting of this story is fishermen tales. These are fishermen, and you know what happens to fishermen tales, of course. So we're not talking about exact reliability, but we're talking about a context of, and guess what? The first followers of Jesus were fishermen. It makes absolute sense that the earliest stories go back to fishermen.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happens is theologians start talking about them, and theologians have bookshelves, and they're full of Babylonian stories, etc. And they see, I see here the resonance. And so they say, well, what's actually happening? Someone is writing here a story 40 years after, and then he's creating this narrative from Babylonian. No. The original stories came from the community, were expanded. Of course, they were expanded, were guided because they were adapted to the audience. And these stories, this particular layer in Mark, quite different from Luke, quite different from Matthew, quite different from John, although John, interestingly, has that story. But you can see what every author is doing. And Mark indeed is the most primitive one with the most fisherman tale-like stuff. And then it's beautiful to see how a Matthew is then saying, well, I'm going to work now, and I'm going to show that Jesus is this and this and this. So I'm going to rehash the miracles, put them in a number of 10 next to each other, present Jesus as the new Moses. And that doesn't take away the original story, but you see that Matthew is working as a composer, as an artist. Same time, Luke comes in and says, I want to explain to people why Paul was giving us the right gospel and not some rather Hellenistic version of it. So let me also, together with the book of Acts, tell you a little bit about that story. He presents himself as a historian. He wants his work to be read as a work of history. So we cannot do the same literary analysis that we do on Matthew on Luke, although Luke is an ancient historian and would be prone to literary conventions of the time, of the genre.
Yeah.
And then you get to John, which is absolutely stunning, much like Plato, he actually feels free to change the words of Jesus. So the funny thing about the first three is that they are sort of condensed versions of what is normal speech, whereas John is expanded speech. And that's interesting because that's the freedom that someone like Plato had. And then when you look at how John is being composed, and later on, you see that parts of it are being recomposed by someone who is afraid to touch the words. And then you get the doublets in the farewell speech, etc. So you see different layers going on, and each gospel tells its own story about how people were impacted by Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested in all those different historical phases, because I think the beauty of it is that it shows that we have to interpret stories, translate them to our own context, as they did. They had to translate these stories to their own context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that is a very worthwhile theological project. And I'll note too that we've now we're moving from like the meta-theoretical, meta-theological into the, into the nitty-gritty, as it were, into the weeds of the Sea of Galilee. But it's also interesting because then at this level of analysis, then there are different perspectives and different models and different theories about how best to account for the data, right? So so in, how would I say this? So like the consensus view about Mark is actually that he must not have written in Palestine because he gets the geography very wrong, right? And so if you just go through the Gospel of Mark and then you see it, then he went here, then he went here, like it doesn't actually make sense. And so a lot of commentators have been led to conclude that Mark was definitely writing outside of Palestine, probably in Alexandria, and didn't have any firsthand, relationship to these materials because he doesn't show any evidence of having any familiarity with the actual, place. So that's a very different account, right, than from this Jewish archaeologist and fisherman who would say, oh, Mark actually got it totally right down to the very specific.
I'm not saying Mark. I'm saying the story.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the Gospel of Mark.
The Gospel of Mark contains the fishing cycle.
Yeah.
And the fishing cycle is going back to fisherman tales.
And that could be that is retaining a historical kernel of stories that were told, right? And in that way. But again, like it becomes deeply problematized once you then see all the different stories. So it's not just that, theologians have books on their shelves and they've read too many books and now they're reading into the calming of the storm. It's the fact that Jesus, quote unquote, rebukes in the Greek text. He rebukes the storm, and that word rebuke, epitomao or something, or I'm probably getting my Greek mixed up because there are multiple aspects to this. He is used in ancient Hebrew in the stories about Yahweh rebuking the chaos waters, right? And so there's clearly, that going on, and the same word in the Septuagint that carries that tradition forward gets picked up by the Greek author, and he uses that word. And the fact that Jesus, of course, is walking in another story, trampling on the water, he muzzles the sea is the word, and I forget the Greek. It begins with an M. He actually that the author uses that word again is the same word that Yahweh muzzled the chaos waters, this sort of a thing. And so it's not just we're just reading things in here. It's like you have to, when you're equipped with the broader contextual information of these other stories, you have to kind of presume that there's some callback going on here, and that carries throughout, so that a lot of these stories or pericopes that get told are too much like that to think that they just happened, right? Like
it goes on. I mean, if you go on later in these stories, especially Matthew, etc., it increases. Mm-hmm. So the point is not that you will not have a Jewish author living in a Jewish cultural religious setting, having religious language in his ears, use that religious language to tell the story. Yeah. Of course you have that. That's not the issue. The point is that the source of that story is, in the eyes of some, abysmally close to the historical Jesus. Mm. And that's interesting. because that tells us how we have to deal. We cannot simply, from a modernist perspective, let go of the historical, as we cannot simply, from a pre-modern perspective, let go of the whole literary history that unfolds after it.
Mhm.
Well, yeah, and I think that what I'm inviting people to do is, and I'll, it becomes a lot less charged when you use other examples of this sort of thing. So I love Homer, I love the Iliad and the Odyssey. They're great texts, right? My feelings were hurt a little bit when I found out that people were like, and maybe there wasn't a Homer who wrote both of these texts, maybe, right? And then you start getting into the work of Milman and Perry and looking at the oral traditions and all this stuff, and then you actually compare the Odyssey and the Iliad, and you see the vocabulary differences, and that there seems to be, these are coming from different oral traditions and all this stuff. And what you're left with after the modern critique is that someone told these stories, wrote them down, gathered them together, and there isn't a Homer per se that did this, right? And so the whole image of this person that comes to us from antiquity has been sort of decomposed or deconstructed. And that's kind of like, that's that, because you can also read so many commentators, right, who are like, Homer uses this word right here, and he used it back in this book here, and it's such a brilliant callback, because it's like, no, actually that was not intentional at all. And it's sort of like, and what I want to suggest is that it's like that's okay. Like, I still love Homer. I love the Iliad and the Odyssey, and there's so much wisdom that comes through and all that, and there's so much beauty there. But we just don't have to hang our hat on, like, either it was all told, and then of course, this isn't to say anything about whether or not the Trojan War happened in any of the way that he's talking about. That's not even going.
That's completely secondary. But that model fits very much, of course, the development of the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of early Christianity, if you've read the work of Rodney Stark, you must be aware of the fact that we're probably talking about perhaps a few thousand people at the most in the period that these books were written. If we apply standard literacy models on that, I don't think they may completely hold, because I think the Jewish people were a bit more literary oriented than others. But anyway, you would be speaking about several tens of people who are possible authors. So the model that we're looking at should not be Homer, should not be the Pentateuch. It should rather be New Testament studies. And then we're talking about a fairly small group of people that we're talking about, and someone like John Mark can have played a role somewhere in the development of the Gospel of Mark. And once that's not a problem. That's a secondary disciple. It's someone like that guy. His name already explains why he is a likely guy, because he has a Jewish and a Latin name. So there's someone translating it to a non-Jewish speaking audience, and he is a second generation. He was not part of the story. I think the interesting thing and the inspiring thing for me from the New Testament is actually that it came together in such a short time, and especially when we start with the letters of Paul, that we sort of can feel the excitement. And I think that, and that's something that's why I'm a Christian, I think that what Jesus brought was a fundamental revolution in how people regard God. If you say there's a development in the idea of God, well, definitely, because as he got a son, he became a father. There's something really exciting going on. And as that son says, you're all my brothers and sisters, certain barriers in the world of late antiquity were challenged profoundly. I mean, we didn't get rid of slavery all of a sudden, but if you read a letter like Philemon, that is a profoundly interesting, moving little letter that tells a nugget of a story about how to deal with slavery within the context of brothers and sisters. So these developments are so exciting that I feel that the closer I can get to what really happened to these people, and we're not talking about in a pre-modern way, but the closer that I can get to that, the more inspiring it is for my faith as well.
Okay, so
and I'm not disregarding here the Pentateuch or what have you, because I also like that literature, but in that case, really the model of Homer is far more applicable.
Okay, so I'm going to have to interrupt you here, just like briefly, because I want to be very respectful of Brandon's time, and we're
of course
running late. So like, Brandon, so a couple things. Well, first of all, you should obviously feel free to respond, and I think this is really getting at the crux of the conversation on, right, why, to what extent history matters and to what extent history can help us actually deepen our faith. But I still understand also some of your drawbacks, and maybe it's also up to you to maybe, I don't know, judge whether or not you think maybe a second conversation is more applicable for this, but that's something we can discuss later, or if you'd like to maybe start going towards closing statements if you prefer we finish off. So I'm gonna give you the word, obviously. Not necessarily the last word, but if you'd like it to be the last word, then
no.
please.
I mean, I got another 15 minutes in me or so. It's not no urgent need to close this. It's great, and it's a wonderful conversation, and I love having this conversation again with someone who has engaged the historical critical stuff, because there's a huge barrier there often just to get to that level, right? And so I think it means a lot, right, if like people have grappled with this material, but there are a diversity of perspectives that can very reasonably be maintained on the other side of that, and I want to allow for that, or not just allow for it, but what I want to speak to that is that it's like I have my response to this stuff, but I also if we're being intellectually honest and we're engaging with this material and we're not sort of like closing our eyes to it, then I think it's just a matter of what people will make of it and what they reasonably conclude on the other side of that. And so that's huge. And again, it's already, I think, marks a distinction between this conversation and most of what I see happening in other contexts, let's say. So there's that. But yeah, I mean, where to go with that? I guess I would just say, one of my questions would be for you, like, kind of that question that, and I've forgotten that guy's name again already, but that guy, that Breyer was asked, which is, what is there anything that you could identify as something that, like, if you learned, it would make you become an atheist or lose your faith? Is there something about this stuff that, like, if a new artifact or something were found, I don't know, I don't, not to box you in, but like, is there any, how would you answer that question? What might make you lose your faith?
Yeah, I can't think of any. No, but I've gone. Of course, I've also gone through my period. I'm a scientific doubter. I doubt everything I hear. So my commitment to my faith is not so much a intellectual commitment. It's an experience, of not being alone, of being loved, of having a place in this universe. And when you go to the Gospel of Philip, it's an interesting Gnostic text. It says anything we say here in our words is with words from here. That means it comes from this reality. It cannot describe the divine in any meaningful way, but still we use it. And it's a beautiful way that they said, well, the truth is one. That's a Neoplatonic or Platonic idea, of course. And then they said, but she became many in order to teach us lovingly about the one. And that is something that I experience in all this richness of different religions, of nature, of art, etc. There is something of that primordial longing that all animals have towards what is beautiful, and all social animals have to what is good, and all rational animals have to what is true, being more pattern-like than dogmatic truth. That longing is expressed in these stories, and I would also say by the historical Jesus in a way that is emotional for me. So I'm in love with Jesus in that sense. Jesus didn't expect, I guess, to be resurrected. I mean, his friends knew he talked about resurrection. And he probably, in his time, expected a general resurrection when the Lord would be coming, the Kurios. But they came to his grave with spices because they didn't think there would be a resurrection going on. And that's material that you need to grapple with. I mean, Jesus, when when I grew up, there wasn't a difference between Jesus and God. But Jesus became fully human in my thinking. I discovered his uniqueness in terms of how he revolutionized my thinking about God and my thinking about other people. I think, and that's why, of course, You could argue Jesus never existed. There will not. No, that's a rather ridiculous claim from an historical point of view. But anyway, you could argue that, and then something else must have happened that created this material. I don't care. That's fine. I don't mind about a physical resurrection, not at all. But I'm not against it either. If it happened, it can happen to you and me as well. Because miracle, by definition, if it is something that cannot happen, then it didn't happen. If it happened, it can happen to other people as well. So whatever the experience was, and there's a beautiful Gospel of Mary that is a sort of retelling of the story of Mary in the garden. That's the John 20 story. Sorry, I'm losing my voice here. And it's not for emotions. But, and then she asks Jesus, Lord, is it in the soul or in the spirit that I see you? Whereas, of course, the Johannine tradition in the end, the last phase of the Johannine tradition wants to say, no, it's what we touched with our hands. So the whole story about, do I see it with my physical eyes? Do I see it with my soul? Do I see it with my spirit? That is a question that was profoundly debated among early Christians. And it didn't mean that they would follow Jesus, yes or no.
Yeah.
And
so
maybe and wait, I also have one question for Brandon that sort of adds on this. I'm curious because obviously I want to know why you asked that question and sort of but then the other thing is like, to what extent would you, for instance, call someone like my father a metamodern Christian? And if why, and if not, why not? Like that would also be a question for you, but please go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, and I'll say the reason why I asked that question is because I like to try to stay a little bit more up in the meta space. It's the same reason why if you start having political conversations with people, they'll quickly, they don't become very generative, to use a term that I use a lot and that you used earlier, right? Whereas if you can hang up in the meta space and not talk about, like in our country, like, well, is Biden, doing the right thing, or is Trump right? And this, it's like, no, that's just going to lead to a cul-de-sac. Whereas if you can ask questions of like, why is the political system the way that we see it today? What are the narratives that we're hearing? And, and you kind of hang out in that space, it can be a lot more rich. And so when we come down into the level of getting into the weeds, that can be, it's necessary and it's important, but it's also, we'll probably just stay at that level and not go anywhere. Right. And so there's a certain amount, and don't get me wrong either. Like, I'm very happy to hang out at that space. I just feel like most of the whole religion versus science debates and the Dawkins New Atheist stuff have tended to hang out at that level, and it reaches a ceiling really quick. And then people pick sides in the same way that they do, right? And so, like, I don't think that that's the really interesting things here. So they're deeper or higher, or whatever metaphor you want to use for this sort of thing, that I think are really the more compelling things. But I also, I don't want to give people the impression that like, oh, Brennan doesn't have anything else to say on that, so, I guess there's nothing more to that. It's like, no, they're like, we could spend the next hour talking about, the Gospels and the evidence for this and that. But yeah, the reason why I feel like it's just like, we got to get out of that scope if you're going to make headway, and get to the stuff that I think really matters. So that was kind of why I moved in that direction. As for, whether this is a metamodern Christianity, that Bus is talking about, is I always am very clear, like, I care a lot about metamodernism. I spent a lot of time in this space, in this paradigm, and I have my own thoughts about it. But I'm not, it would be ridiculous, and I don't think anyone even thinks of this anyway. So maybe it's I protest too much. But like, I'm not in the position to make pronouncements on what is or is not metamodern in that sense. All I can do is try to suggest, well, I tend to look at it this way, and I think there's a good way of thinking about metamodernism in this manner. And if you do that, then it leads to these kinds of conclusions and that sort of a thing. So like, but from where I sit, I mean, I would say this at least is that, there's clearly an engagement with the modern historical critical material, a deep engagement, that Bus has done in moving through a whole PhD program and dealing with this stuff. And on the other side of that, there's a rich faith that, connects to a spiritual core of this tradition. And so We haven't talked much about postmodern sorts of things, so they came up a little bit. And I'm sure if we spent some time with that, there'd be a good amount there. I mean, Bus, you were talking about trying to get your students to think about, who these people are, where they're coming from, context. So I think all that's there. And if if at the end of the day you're familiar with these things and you land in a certain place, then yeah, I would call that a metamodern space to hang out in and to have some meaningful differences and debate. I think that's very rich. And and there are different forms, like postmodernism or modernism, right? These are these very broad terms that have instances that actually, you would say disagree with each other, even in a profound sense, right? Like I mean, you could look at different forms of postmodern thought that actually might be diametrically opposed to one another, that would fundamentally disagree, and yet we'd still call them both kind of postmodern in some way. So I think that's the nice thing about these sorts of terms, is that they're very encompassing and that there's a lot of room for what we mean by these things. But a minimal, in my view, kind of criterion is that you have to engage with the modern and the postmodern, and of course the pre-modern as well, to kind of get there. And as you were saying earlier, Aaron, that there's a way in which people can use the postmodern to bypass the modern and then just affirm like the pre-modern. And that's what I really want to avoid the word metamodern signaling to people, right? There's a danger in that becoming a thing of like, oh, metamodernism is about the return of these other ways of thinking from the past that we can integrate into the future. And so ... And if that just looks like, no, thank you, historical critical scholarship, I in the name of Jesus eschew you, it's like, that's not, you're not going to get an anti-fragile, robust metamodern Christianity from that. So anyway, so yeah, all that being said, I think that it's in that ballpark, and it's this space for some rich conversation.
Yeah.
The last thing I guess I would just say on a lot of these fronts is that I would say that obviously scholarship can have, and this is another thing that I think a lot of people who don't dance in these spaces might be confused by, because they tend to think that there's just like one answer to questions, right? But it's like, scholarship is a field of asking questions, and it's a field of assembling evidence and making claims and trying to justify it with the evidence, right? And if you can do that, you're playing sort of the modern rational game, right? And then, and people might balk at that and they say, well, apologetics is doing that too, but there are many ways in which you could literally, again, present the bones of Jesus to someone and they wouldn't see it because they don't want to see it. And I think that there's something about the modern scholarly evidence-driven approach that's sort of like, I gotta see that, it needs to be folded in. And so if we're being intellectually honest, I think that's the whole thing about it. And so all that being said, I think people do need to appreciate that even in the field of biblical studies and even in historical Jesus studies, there are going to be different takes. N.T. Wright is a brilliant scholar who's gone very deeply into this stuff. He's familiar with it. I very much disagree with him. And if you were to put him and Bart Ehrman in a room, and I would even say him and probably most other biblical scholars, there'd be a lot of disagreement, right? He has a more theological vision that is still a bit more in accord with more traditional views than, say, other kind of scholars hold to, I would say, kind of in general. But so that being the case, right, there's this kind of diversity, and we should welcome that and celebrate it. So where I land to bring this all home is I am very much a kind of Bart Ehrman, or how would I say? I'm very convinced by the Bart Ehrmans of the world, right? When Bart Ehrman speaks about things, I'm like, yep, that's probably pretty much how that is. When N.T. Wright speaks about things, I'm kind of like, oh, this sounds a lot like special pleading, and he's trying really hard to make this fit, and that's just what it is. And so different people will have different places they're coming from, and different things will be convincing to them. But at this point in my life, I'm very comfortable with the most radical deconstruction you could do of all the history of Christianity. And I want to say that you can still be a Christian on the other side of all that. And I want people to hear that and like have that as an option for them. I feel like if we tie things too much to certain kinds of evidence and certain kinds of historical framings, then they become more loose and more fragile. And the last thing I'll say, sorry, I've said a few last things. There's like the few last words of Jesus, right? Like, the last thing I'll say is that this is not coming from a motivated place in the sense that I am a Christian with a Christian doctrine that I'm trying to uphold, and therefore I'm trying really hard to make this work. I want there to be Christians in the world. I probably, if you were to ask me, if you were just ask me if I'm a Christian, I'd be like, well, what do you mean by that and all that, right? So I don't go to church. I don't read the Bible every day. I don't identify with the sorts of like, things that Christians do and all that. So this isn't me coming at this issue being like, I am a Christian and I'm trying to make my Christianity work. It's that I'm kind of sitting a little bit here on the fringe, having gone through all this and being like, there should be a metamodern Christianity. There should be a robust post-transhistorical Christianity that, looks at these things in a different way. And I think that there needs to be, relative to the, the history of just Western culture in general and all that the Christian tradition has to offer and the role that it's played in those kinds of developments that Bas was talking about earlier. So, that's kind of the tack I'm taking. And yeah, it may be that some people really don't find that to be something that resonates with them. And for some people, it might be the only thing that can allow them to continue being a Christian. And I want to kind of give them the okay on that, as it were, to be like, yep, that, don't let more conservative forms of Christianity force you to conclude that you can't be a Christian because you can't affirm certain historical creedal statements or something like that. And we could dig into all that. Anyway, I've talked way too much, so I'll stop talking now.
No, you're like actually, I think when my father first met my current partner, so as you already said, like she doesn't believe in God, for instance, but he was like, yeah, but she's very Christian, don't worry, it kind of made that move. And I was like, which is kind of funny because I think at the time I didn't even identify as a Christian, and I'm kind of now in this, I don't know, weird space, where also I would also say, like, it depends on what you mean, but anyways,
Yeah.
like, besides that, so I think I think we feel some liberty to not also gatekeep Christianity and be like, oh, like, well, if you're a Christian, like, you have to sort of do this. But that's sort of like, I think, my 2 cents for now. I very much appreciate this. I'm gonna also, I think, then give the last word to Bas, if you want to finish things off, and then
Can I just say one more thing, even though I
yeah,
already said that I said many last things?
yeah.
Just to your both of your credit, like, it's a beautiful relationship that you both have. I think this is a very wonderful thing, like that, Bas, you've studied these things and like you did this PhD, and Aaron, that you and Bas talk about faith and religion, and the very fact that like you, Aaron, could go through a period where you were doubting, and maybe you still are, and that there's this atheistic period, and like that, Bas, you can kind of just be there for that and be like, hey, like, I'm here if you have questions or everything, and be supportive.
Yeah,
That's what matters. That's what matters. And
yeah.
so that is a metamodern Christianity.
I
So
do
I want
agree,
to
man.
communicate that very profoundly, because
Yeah,
if it's not that, then it's going to be this imposition of, oh, you're sinning, you're falling away, you're backsliding, you're this and that. And so you're flourishing, and that's what matters. So if people can flourish and be supportive
yeah.
and help people through the spiritual journey in all of its different forms,
Mm-hmm.
that's what metamodern spirituality is about. I guess
No,
that's my official last word.
yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And I would also like, I think I would add to that, like, even though I think there's something to the fact that, you're also formed by your crises, and you've obviously gone through your own fair share of existential crises, that at the same time, like, there's a part of me when I hear your story that obviously I would have wanted for you to kind of have had like that type of relationship, and that it's like, and that I do, and that I also curious, like, what kind of individual would you be like had you, for instance, grown up in the Netherlands, to just kind of like name one example. So it's kind of interesting, and like I'll say a couple of things that for me would be interesting to talk about later. So obviously not now. Like, I'm just saying, like, for me there's like lots more to unpack. It would be specifically the fact of like your interest in creativity, and me seeing that show up relatively little in the rest of the metamodern space, and being, well, at least like in my perspective, less there. So I'm actually very like encouraged by the fact that you're doing that and you're bringing the poetry sort of to this space, because that's really one thing that makes me sometimes doubt, let's say, going too much to that direction, because I love so much of the beauty that I sort of have gotten from religion. And that's why I think it's very valuable kind of stuff you're doing. And indeed, like the point that is often brought up, but that everyone's keenly aware of, and John Vervaeke too, is obviously that we're afraid this is maybe too elitist if we like talk about like this stuff in this way. But I know that you're caring about that. So it's not like, oh, gotcha. It's just like, I would be curious like to maybe talk about that at some point in the future, but we'll have to see about that. Bas, I'm going to give you the final word then on this. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to run a little ad.
Yeah.
Everybody must find his or her own way. You do too. I mean, that's true. But you also have something to pass on to new generations. And whatever is profoundly meaningful, you have to open that, I should say, treasure trove in an open way that people can make their own choices and find their own way. And this is my treasure trove. If I have been grown up as a Muslim, I might have been different, but this is what I have to offer. And what I have to offer is so overwhelmingly beautiful and comforting and inspiring, etc., that it's difficult to not offer that. And part of my problems with academia has been that it has been something of a stale discussion. And I would like us to be more aware, and that's very much a postmodern or even a metamodern thing, of the fact that we are all engaging in creating new narratives and creating new stories, and we should do it as beautifully as possible, as challenging as possible, as comforting as possible. If we engage, and perhaps even as spiritually as possible, because if we can be aware of the fact that we are indeed engaging in power structures also as academics, and we are imposing on other people, we can also be servants. We can also try to make it as beautiful as possible. And I think that the work that we do should, well, at least for some people, be helpful. And if we can contribute, and these discussions can contribute to that, I'm very thankful to you, Brandon, for opening up here.
Yeah.
Then I think we're doing a good thing.
Yeah. Then maybe because you are the guest, Brandon, I will give you one final last word, and then we'll finish this off. Yeah.
I've more than used up all my last words, so I'll just say thank you both so much. This was beautiful and very rich, and I would love to do another conversation. So yeah, let's plan
great.
for that and dig into whatever else, and that can be any number of things. I mean, we could do multiple too. Like if we wanted to start, I mean, it's been some years since I've been fully enmeshed in some of the scholarship, so I'm not sure if I could play as adequately in those waters as I once could, but we could dig in more to the weeds and explore these things, but maybe that's also not really what matters. I agree with the staleness of academia, and it's if you get stuck there, if you leave it there, you're clearly missing something. So we need to move through the insights of the modern historical critical academic scholarship to faith, to spirituality, to religion, to Christianity on the other side of that. It's not to suggest what I'm getting at, that we end at, oh, and now we have the Q source and the documentary hypothesis, and now we get everything that spirituality and Christianity is about. But I appreciate you as an interlocutor, Bas, to be able to navigate the spiritual and the Christian in a way that is inflected by those insights, which I think is just sort of the minimum that I'm really kind of encouraging people to be open to at the very least. And so that's the last thing I'll say. But thank you both so much. This was really wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brandon, for coming on. I really appreciate, like, I think I've said it throughout. I've messaged you before saying, like, the way you sort of entered into this corner has, for me, always been very pleasant, and that really makes it worth engaging. Like that composure, first of all, and that really makes us interested, because if you would have been like, I don't know, kind of like shady and would have been like, I don't know, I kind of look down on you folks, like then we wouldn't have been interested, because like for us, like I think the ethic really comes first in some ways, and how you compose yourself, I think we really appreciated that, and I've really appreciated this conversation. And yes, we'll see what's possible. I'm gonna end the recording here, but thank you so much. Okay, bye-bye.